everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about underhyped books. So there are those books that we've all heard of, whether we've read them or not, whether we spend a lot of time on BookTube or not. They're either super hyped in the bookshops, by the literary prizes, or on BookTube. And like I said, we've all heard of them. We may or may not have read them. We may or may not want to read them, but there's no escaping their presence. There are, however, so many wonderful books out there that have yet to experience that hype. They just have not caught the BookTube bug. Not enough people have read them for them to be talked about widely enough. Not enough people have heard about them, but they are so fantastic and I have really enjoyed them myself. So I wanted to focus in on some of the books that I love that I don't hear talk about very often. Specifically 10 books. Now the way I picked these books is that I looked at my Goodreads read shelf and I organised them by number of ratings. So there is also an element of Goodreads deciding what these books are, but I know a lot of people do use Goodreads both on BookTube and off BookTube, in the blogosphere world and just recreationally in their own lives. So I think it gives some indication of a book's popularity and renown. It obviously isn't the be all and end all. There are books that have won really big literary prizes, I noticed, that still have less than 1,000 ratings on Goodreads. So like I said, it's not necessarily a reflection of sales or number of readers, but it gives an indication, doesn't it? I mean, we all know Harry Potter is not going to be on the lower end of that spectrum. And I looked for books that I myself had given 4 or 5 stars that I'd really enjoyed and would be really comfortable recommending to you, and also just feel like I haven't heard talked about much. So not only do they have fewer ratings, but I haven't actually heard them talked about very often, and all of the books in this video have less than 500 ratings on Goodreads. Those could be positive, sort of neutral, or less positive reviews, but I like them and I feel like not enough people are necessarily reading them because they would enjoy them too. I also want to say that 500 really isn't that low a number of ratings. As you probably know, I myself have published a book. It's a children's book, it's on Goodreads, and it has 200 and something ratings, which to me feels spectacular. Like, I am blown away by the fact that over 200 people have rated my book on Goodreads. So again, I'm not trying to say that these books haven't had attention or haven't had praise, because I wouldn't want to make the authors of those books feel less appreciated, but I feel like they are still not necessarily being seen as by as many people as they could possibly be seen by. So I'm going to start from the bottom up, from the least number of ratings on Goodreads, and then work through the 10 books on my list. I'm also going to tell you how many ratings they have on Goodreads because I think that's interesting. Now, a couple of books that I maybe would have included in this video because I rated them 4 or 5 stars and they had under 500 ratings aren't actually out yet or literally just came out, so I feel like it's not the best indication of sort of hype because they've just not had any time to be rated. So these are all books that at least came out in 2020 or before. And with all of those caveats covered, let's get in to the books. So the first book on my list is The Women in the Room: Labour's Forgotten History by Sloan, which only has 14 ratings on Goodreads. Now I know at least one more person has read that book than it has ratings on Goodreads because my mum has read it and she doesn't rate things on Goodreads. So there's another indication of how a book just might not be hyped in certain spaces, but that's one of those spaces. This is one of those spaces, and I loved this book. This is a non-fiction book that I actually think was in my top books of 2019 rundown video, and it's all about women's role in the labour movement in the United Kingdom. So both in their role as part of the foundation and the early incarnation of the actual Labour Party, the political party that was founded at the end of the 1800s, and just as part of the lowercase labour movement, so the sort of workers movements, the trade unions movements, the emancipation movements, the movements for more voting rights both to women and to working class people in the United Kingdom. So it covers a wide breadth of stuff, and I absolutely love this because I find when I do read about the history of both labour movement, of the trade union movement, of like left-wing politics in any country really, there's a real focus on men, and that's because they were the ones that had the vote, they were the ones that were able to stand as members of parliament, they were the ones that just had the front-facing recognition, while women were still so much a part of that, both as ordinary like working people who made up those masses, and also as like more well-renowned voices who were writers and journalists and political advocates that, you know, would have been known in their time but haven't really had the recognition in history. And this book really centres in on those women, and it was such an incredible reading experience because there was women that I had actually heard of but never in this context. So women like E. Nesbit, who wrote The Railway Children, a quite famous piece of British children's literature. But I didn't know of her political background, and I loved learning about that. I loved learning about the complexities of these women who I've known as children's writers but never known as political activists, and that is so unfortunate because women were integral to the labour movement in Britain, and I imagine elsewhere, and this book really highlights that. And one of the takeaways from this book was that I learned so many new names, so many new women, also men that I hadn't heard of, and felt so intrigued to learn more about. It was a really great jumping off point to look for more history in this area and a really good overview. So I just think this book's fantastic and more people should absolutely read it. The next book on my list is You Sad Feminist by Megan Beach. Now this is actually a poetry collection and it has thus far had 57 ratings on Goodreads, but I can assure so many of you that you would adore this poetry collection if you haven't checked it out already. This is by one of my favourite poets. She has 2 collections currently out, this one and When I Grow Up I Want to Be Mary Beard, which has a few more ratings on Goodreads. But You Said Feminist is a fantastic one because I know a lot of you are interested in feminist literature and it has those overtones, it deals with feminist issues, it deals with solidarity and finding supportive feminist networks, and also like just generally being a political activist and someone with political inclinations whilst dealing with your own personal struggles, with your own mental health struggles. But it's about like taking care of yourself and taking care of everybody else, and it does all that through poetry. Very accessible poetry written in a very rhythmic but accessible way. Like I enjoy the full frontal nature of Megan Beach's poems. I feel like the messages and the sentiments are at the forefront of everything she writes and it comes through very loud and clear, and it's very empowering. I actually find myself quite emotional reading this poetry collection as someone who struggled with depression and anxiety and OCD and other like mental health struggles in the past, but I also found it very empowering, and I think you would both enjoy it if you're somebody who has had mental health struggles, but also if you just have friends and family members who have mental health struggles. I just think it could help you understand and support them as well. I love it. I think it does a lot in a few poems and that's wonderful, and it just, like I said, has that beautiful rhythm that you look for and style that you look for in poetry that suits me. So love this collection. I then have one that I've actually been championing for a few months now. I've talked about this book in quite a few videos recently. It was in my top 10 romances video, it was in my favourite books of 2020, but it still only has 86 ratings on Goodreads, and I know so many more of you would enjoy it, so I want to mention it again, and that's The Lady's Deception by Susannah Craig. This is a historical 1800s romance novel set in Ireland, and it's about a young woman whose brother is trying to forcefully marry her off. She doesn't have her independence, she's not at an age to inherit the money her father left her in his will, and she does not want to go into this marriage. Is with a man that she does not like, who does not have any respect for her, and therefore she decides to run away from home and seek out the assistance of a lawyer. So she ends up coming across said lawyer in the city, and he's a little bit drunk when they first meet, so he mistakes her for the governess he'd sent away to hire to look after his younger siblings, and therefore we have some mistaken identities. She ends up taking on this job as governess to look after his younger siblings in the hopes that she can ride out the time until she's able to inherit, and also maybe look for the assistance of this lawyer. But naturally they fall in love because it's a romance novel, and I love their romance because despite all of the miscommunication, misunderstandings, mistaken identities, they do communicate, and as soon as like secrets are uncovered, they talk through them. They also bring out the best in one another, which I think is the ideal scenario for a romance novel, and they're just very respectful, and I really appreciate that. I also enjoy their chemistry and think there's a nice layer of comedic levity within this novel, especially from the younger siblings, and it is just one of my absolute favourites. Such a perfect one for fans of Tessa Dare, who I know has tons of hype, so I wanted to include it here. We then have a YA sci-fi novel, and that is The Fallen Children by David Owens. So this is actually inspired by, it's a retelling of The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, which is a mid-20th century sci-fi classic that I really enjoy. John Wyndham is one of my favourite classic sci-fi authors, and I remember being so excited about the promise of this novel when it came out, and it did not disappoint. In fact, it offers so much more than The Midwich Cuckoos. Now, it couldn't have existed without The Midwich Cuckoos, so we have to give kudos to that book, but it really builds on that book and explores so many deeper, meaningful themes that get overlooked in that book. And in this scenario, you can read this book without having read The Midwich Cuckoos, I like to point out. In this scenario, we have an alien invasion that takes place one night in one council estate in London, where the young women in this building, living in this council estate in different apartments, end up pregnant. They all wake up having no idea or having little idea of what has happened to them, pregnant, with every indication pointing to this having been an alien invasion and an alien impregnation. And it is so wonderful because what this book does is it takes this premise, which in The Midwich Cuckoos is about a village where all the women wake up pregnant because of an alien invasion, and explores the trauma those women experienced. We get very little from the perspective of the women in The Midwich Cuckoos. It's more about the mystery and the disturbing nature of the children who are subsequently born. In The Fallen Children, we get to explore that trauma that these women and these girls have gone through, and their reactions to this violation by an alien species and this unwanted pregnancy and how they deal with that. I honestly had no idea that I needed a YA sci-fi retelling of The Midwich Cuckoos, but as soon as I read it, I was so happy that it existed. It also touches on issues of class and poverty in Britain, which I really, really appreciate, and thought it just all came together so perfectly. Oh, and before I move on, The Fallen Children has 244 ratings on Goodreads. To return to romance, however, we actually have an FF romance, or a romance between two women in the 1800s, and that is A Lady's Desire by Lily Maxton. Now, first up, I was so pleased to discover and read this book because it's so hard to find historical FF romances. It's a little bit easier when it comes to contemporary romances, but historical FF romances are so few and far between. And then there's obviously the possibility that you're not going to enjoy everyone that's out there, so the fact that I did enjoy this, I was so happy about, and it just made me want to seek out more. I hope that this author writes more in the future, and I'd love more recommendations of authors who have tackled the historical FF romance. This is about two women who were childhood friends but separated when the older of the two women was married in her teen years to the younger woman's cousin and went off to live in the city. So they were separated because of this marriage, and it also added a layer of tension to their friendship that neither of them could quite put their finger on. And it's a few years later when the husband has passed away and our older of the two friends has returned to where she grew up to stay with her childhood best friend, who's no longer her best friend. They have kept in touch, but in a very perfunctory manner. They are not close anymore. There is a lot of resentment and a lot of tension there. And now as adults, both single again, both living in the same house, they're finally able to confront that that is perhaps because their feelings toward one another are not just friendship, they are romantic. And it is so wonderful seeing them explore this romantic relationship. I really loved both characters. I thought their romance was super sweet, and I would love to catch up with them and see what else is going on in their lives in another book, maybe in the future. But yeah, I had to mention this one here because it only has 330 ratings on Goodreads. I say only, again, like I mentioned, my book has less than that and it doesn't feel like a small number, but we're just going with under 500 as a reasonable category for underhyped in this case. Next up we have a middle grade novel, which is Bloom by Nicola Skinner, and this has 359 ratings on Goodreads. I've actually, again, recommended this book a lot. It was longlisted for the 2020 Blue Peter Children's Book Awards, which I was one of the judges of, and I adored this book. I absolutely fell in love with the main character and Nicola Skinner's writing. I am so excited to read more of her books. She has a second one out and another one on the way, so really looking forward to diving into those at some point. But this is all about our protagonist Sorrel, who lives in a town that looks less and less green by the day. This book does touch on environmental issues and sort of building up areas and the destruction of green spaces and the impact that this has on communities. And within this story, Sorrel ends up the owner of some magical seeds that end up infecting the town so that people start growing flowers from their heads. And it's so beautiful and imaginative, the kind of imagery that would completely capture a young child but is also so engaging. To me as an adult, I just found myself completely enraptured by this story. I love the plot, I love the issues it dealt with, I love the character of Sorrel, I love that it explored her relationship with her mum, which is sometimes a little bit tense. I really appreciated that. I really appreciate when children's books and YA books do address sort of relationships with family members and the guardians of those characters. That I really appreciate, and I like those complexities. It also featured such a wonderful friendship between Sorrel and her best friend. It was so cute. Her best friend is a wannabe scientist and the complete opposite of Sorrel in so many ways, because she is a bit of a rebel whereas Sorrel always toes the line, and this is the first time that Sorrel has ever really gone against the rules, and it does touch on issues of when maybe it is time to break the rules and when the status quo shouldn't be followed, and I really enjoyed that. It was, like I said, so imaginative and just full of such fantastic imagery and storytelling. We then have a collection of short stories, and one of the things I'm really enjoying about doing this video is the diversity of genres and books that are turning up. The collection of short stories I want to mention to you is New World Fairy Tales by Cassandra Parkin. This is my last book with less than 400 ratings, with 367 in total. And it is a collection of fairy tale retellings, which is probably given away by the title. And it is probably my favourite collection of fairy tale retellings of all time, although that is tricky to say because Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue is probably up there too. Maybe they're tied for top place, but they're quite different. Most of the stories in this collection take place in a more contemporary setting, and there are elements of magic realism in some of them, but in others they feel completely and entirely realistic, although there's something rather magical about the prose that makes them feel fairy tale-esque, even though they have a very contemporary realistic backdrop. We have stories including Snow White and Jack and the Beanstalk, and each one is told in the format of it being an interview with a character from that fairy tale. We have redemption for villains, we have queer retellings, we have commentary on modern issues, and I love the imagination of this collection, but I also love the writing. I just think Cassandra Parkin is the most stunning writer, and I would recommend it to everyone, even if you're not big short story collection readers, because I think this could maybe be the one that gets you into them. Then we actually have a second non-fiction book, and that is Not All Dead White Men, Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age by Donna Zuckerberg, which has 431 ratings on Goodreads. Now I can kind of appreciate why this one maybe has a few less ratings, because it does come across as a slightly niche topic, but it actually deals with a very expansive and important modern issues just through a very specific lens, and I still think it could be enjoyed and accessed by a very wide audience. It does deal with the sort of misogynistic, do we call it underbelly, because it feels quite prominent sometimes, realm of the internet. All the groups and subforums, all of the groups and forums and subreddits and 4chan communities championing incredibly misogynistic views on the world, and which are very demeaning to women and really disturbing. This book is written by a classicist, Donna Zuckerberg, and it approaches these subsections of the internet, of misogyny on the internet, through looking at the way they use classical mythology and ancient history to defend their views. And it's so disturbing to read as a woman, as a human being who just respects equality, and as an ancient historian, to see the way in which that people manipulate ancient history to defend really sexist ideas, but also just take incredibly outdated ideas in societies and try to impose them onto our modern world, things that we have fought against for so many centuries. centuries and millennia. And like I said, it's disturbing and scary to read about these groups, especially as a woman on the internet that does occasionally deal with the odd troll that seems to have crept out from this section of the internet. But it feels very important to sort of understand that rhetoric and to address that rhetoric, and I feel it's even more important as somebody who's really into ancient history and classical mythology to understand what people are attempting to do out there with my discipline. The penultimate book on this list, however, is The Fires of the Faithful by Naomi Kritzer, which has 474 ratings on Goodreads, and the sequel has even less, so I felt it was very appropriate for it to be on this list. It's a fantasy duology with a queer protagonist at its heart. It's also a very complex political fantasy duology, and I think it is so creative. I love the world that's built up in this series. It has elements of historical Italian culture woven in there, which is super interesting. And it follows a young woman who's studying at a musical conservatory. She is very, very good at music. All aspects really, but her speciality is the violin. And while she is studying at this conservatory, a new student comes to study with them and they immediately strike up a bond. There's something quite secretive and unknown about this young woman, but she's drawn to her and they are roommates, so they are pushed together a little bit in that sense, but they strike up this bond, like I said. However, all is not as it seems, and there's a lot of political upheaval outside of this conservatory in the rest of the realm. There is famine sweeping the land, and there's a lot of religious persecution. This is a world in which one religion dominates, the new religion, and anybody who is seen to be practicing the old religion is a criminal and is executed. And one of the things that this new student brings to their school is music of the old religion, which they end up becoming fascinated with. So they're drawn in to this music, which then forces them to engage with the political side of this religious persecution that is going on in their community. And I don't want to say more than that because the book has so many twists and turns in the storylines, and so much happens in both book 1 and book 2, but that's the initial premise. Plus, like I mentioned, this is a queer fantasy. Our main protagonist realises as the story goes on that she's attracted to women, she's not attracted to men, but she knows that she faces rejection if she is to make this knowledge public. So it's both about this much wider political fantasy storyline, but also about this young woman's coming out and coming to terms with her sexuality. We then, last but not least, have our final book, which has 487 ratings on Goodreads, so it's just made this video. Is so close to having 500 ratings, and I think a few of you could go out there and be the 13 people who get it there, and that is Hear the World Entire by Anwen Hayward, which is a retelling of the Greek myth of Medusa. So you may know Medusa as the snake-haired gorgon who turned men to stone in Greek and Roman mythology, but a lot of people don't know the background of Medusa's story, the reasons that she even ended up this monstrous gorgon in the first place, because Medusa in most versions of the myth was born a human, and the reason that she is transformed is because she is sexually assaulted by the god Poseidon and then punished by Athena for having been sexually assaulted in Athena's temple. Once again, a mortal in Greek mythology caught in the crosshairs of the god's ire. And it is such a tragic story, and it's so unfortunate that she has, as part of modern culture, become known as this monster, and that the other side of her story has often been very overlooked. It explores issues of trauma and victim blaming through the lens of this Greek myth, and it is so beautiful and sensitive, and I really feel like one that does Medusa justice in a way that I wish I saw more often. So I would just highly recommend it to any fans of Greek mythology watching this video. But those are the 10 books I want to talk about which I consider underhyped, that I think you should all stop sleeping on and give a few more rating on Goodreads because they're fabulous. I would love to hear from you if you have any books that you feel are underhyped, whether because of the number of ratings they've had on Goodreads or just generally because you don't hear a lot of people talk about them on BookTube. I am always looking for more niche recommendations that may deserve a few more fans, so let me know. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.